Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a fascinating and encouraging conversation with the designer, writer, and educator Natalia Ilyin. Natalia is a professor at the Cornish College of Arts in Seattle, where she teaches design history and criticism, design for social activism, and transition design. And she's also a founding faculty member of the MFA in graphic design at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. At Cornish, she co-founded the Parallel Narratives publishing experiment, where she is dedicated to making design history more inclusive by growing historical data from the student up rather than from the historian down. But this episode was actually recorded on the publication day of her brand new book, Writing for the Design Mind, and that's where we begin this conversation. We talk about the relationship between design and writing and how she encourages designers to think about writing, as well as her approach to teaching design history, finding your place in the design community, and the value of criticism in the design field. I loved this conversation. It went into places that I was not expecting and got much more personal than I anticipated, but I just loved talking to Natalia and appreciated her approach and thinking. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Scratching the Surface is supported in part by listeners like you. 1 year ago, we launched the membership program to help support the ongoing production of the podcast. If you enjoy the show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that recaps the month's episodes and gives a preview of who's on next, as well as links to recent work and news from all of the former guests. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this really wonderful conversation with Natalia Ilyin. Over the last week or so, I've been reading your new book, Writing for the Design Mind, and I love it. And I've been thinking about you and that you were the person to write this book, and I think you are the perfect person to write this book. But it got me thinking, what came first for you? Were you a designer first or interested in design first, or were you interested in writing and being a writer first?
Oh, that is such a hard question. You would start out with a hard question. You. Okay, so I have to backtrack. So I am ambidextrous. I write with my left hand, but I do a lot of things with my right hand. And, you know, when you take those little tests about your brain, my brain is rather divided perfectly. So
yeah.
The mess that it is divided into two equal parts. And I come from a family that is a bunch of writers and a bunch of artists. My mother was a hat designer. She was a milliner, and my father was a painter. So from a very young age, I was doing both equally.
Right.
And there was a very bad moment when I was in my 20s when an art director said, Natalia, you're going to have to pick whether it's going to be images or words. And I said, no, I couldn't pick that. And so it actually sort of dogged me through my academic, the time that I was a student. But later on, it became a gift.
So what did you pick when you were told that you had to pick? What decision did you make?
I quit the job and went to New York and became an art director. So I guess I did pick images for a while there. Yeah. It goes back and forth.
So how did the writing come back in, or was that always a part of?
It wasn't. So I went to grad school because I didn't know anything about design. I had had an English degree, a degree in British literature.
Okay.
But I could make money as a designer, so I was a completely self-taught graphic designer. I worked for a poster designer named David Lance Goins, who's a Berkeley poster designer, very California, sort of a nouveau secessionist, right?
Yeah,
big thing in the 80s, big in the 80s. That would make a good title. Anyway. And he's a charming man and autodidact, really interesting guy, actually. So I worked for him, and then I went to New York and worked as an art director. And then I was running out of steam because I didn't have enough education. I didn't have things to uh, look into and say, oh, I can do it this way. Let me take a look
Mm-hmm.
at, somebody. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know anything about that. So I went to grad school thinking that it would bump up my ability to access different aspects of design. But what it did was make me realize that I wasn't a designer, that what I really like to do is talk about design and worry about design, think about other people's design, and help my my professors write their books. But I
Yeah.
didn't really like to design, and I had taste, but I wasn't a genius designer. And I went to school with people who were genius designers, so it was very clear to me what I was not.
Was that I I'll tell you a little bit of a personal story that hopefully will lead to a question. Um, I studied graphic design in undergrad, worked as a designer for a while, but always had an interest in writing, in criticism,
Mm-hmm.
in kind of the more academic side of design. Just all the stuff around design was always something that was very interesting to me. And so
Mm-hmm.
my goal in going to grad school was to find a way to build a career that could include all of those other things, because I couldn't find a place to do that in the jobs that I had, and the types of design work I was doing kind of wasn't that interesting to
Oh,
me.
right. Yeah, I get that.
And yeah, and so I went to grad school almost thinking maybe I'm going to move away from design and move into writing about design, talking about design,
Mm-hmm.
curating shows about design, teaching design. And then I got to grad school and kind of realized that I also still liked the design process and still found a lot of value in the design process, and kind of, okay, now how do I do all of these things?
Mm-hmm.
And so now, post grad school, I
You
have this career where I'm doing all of those things.
are.
And I kind of am starting to think, design is actually, out of all of these things I'm doing, the actual design part is probably the thing that I'm the least good at. And maybe I'm like kind of how you're talking about, where it's like I'm an okay designer, I'm a mediocre designer, I have taste, I know how to
Yeah,
do things,
right,
I can do work, but I'm not a design genius. But
right.
I think I'm kind of good at teaching. I think I'm kind of good
Mhm,
at talking about these things. I think I'm
mhm,
good at organizing things around it.
mhm.
And it's been, I'm telling you all of this because it's something it's so funny to hear you say this, because it's something that's been on my mind the last couple of months as I kind of think about my future and
Yeah,
where I kind of want my career to go. And and I'm torn because design is the only thing that I've ever done, and it's so core to my identity, and I don't know if I want to like truly admit to myself that my place in the design field might not actually be as a designer,
that
or
is
being a designer is a small part of that.
you've been in well, that's incredibly painful time. And
Yeah.
also it is because you've been inculcated by graduate school and by school in general and by people you know and by the
Hmm.
hierarchy of design that that's what you wanna do. You wanna be a designer. And it's extremely difficult for people who are good at 2 things to find a niche or find a more like a I'm thinking of a climbing wall, finding a comfortable spot on the climbing wall because it is not as a well-trammeled uh, path, you know?
Right, right.
And each person who does it, we do very similar things. I don't have a podcast. I'd be terrible at that because all I want to do is talk about myself. So, but,
Yeah.
but we do similar things, and
Yeah,
we've found different places on the climbing wall.
right.
But I think it's a harder road, but it's also, for me, it has been a much more satisfying road than designing was because you know what you have to be a mature person to say I'm not that great at that but I'm
Yeah.
really good at this. You have to be rather than I'm great at everything, which is sort of what we inculcate.
Right. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of where I was going, or kind of the question that I was thinking about is, A, what has that been like for you, kind of realizing that and moving forward, but then also kind of in that moment and kind of realizing that and kind of deciding that your work and your place is on the other side of this.
Hmm.
Was that a hard realization for you? How'd you kind of
You know how I
feel about
figured
that?
that out? The way I figured that out is by listening to
Mm.
people's criticism, and not criticism like negative stuff, but just what they
Hmm.
said to me. And what people said to me all the time, they'd be like, oh, that's okay, that whatever thing you made, That's like, yeah, that's nice and everything. But look at that. I mean, that is such an interesting article you wrote. Right?
Right.
So you just like suddenly the key goes up and everything. You have to really listen to what people are saying to you and hear it.
Yeah.
Are they saying more to you, Jarrett, about your podcast or about the whatever thing it is that you just designed? You have to
Right.
you have to look at that and you have to say, first of all, there's a certain amount of them being exposed to your podcast more, probably. So you have to think about that. But what are they saying to you? And then does that correspond to what you feel inside yourself?
Right. Right.
They're really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I don't want this whole conversation to just be kind of therapy about
No,
about my career choices.
happy to do it, but that's not what's going on. What we're saying to each other is we both have had this experience. How did you do it? How did you do it? Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
that's
yeah, and you're exactly right. And for a long time, just to kind of wrap that up, that strand up for a second. You're exactly right. And I had a hard time when the podcast started getting more and more listeners,
right.
that the designers that I admired, the designers that I wanted to be like when I was in college, now know who I am,
Yes.
but they know who I am because of a podcast, not because of any design work.
Yes.
And I didn't like that for a long time. I felt really weird about it, and I don't anymore. Kind of, it's exactly what you're saying. I know what you mean.
Yeah. No, it's a funny thing, and I think people who are listening to your podcast and hear us saying that they might have one of two reactions. They might say, "Oh, well, this person basically rationalized themselves into another career," or they'll look at themselves and ask themselves the hard questions. Am I a designer? Is that my best use of my time on the planet? And if
Right.
not, what is my best use? And that's a hard question, very hard.
And honestly, one of the goals for the podcast that I actually hadn't totally connected to my own career or my own experience until this conversation is that I want to show people who are interested in design that there are multiple ways to be in this world. There are different ways to practice design. There are different ways to be a part of the design world. Design is a lot bigger than we are often taught and often kind of are trained.
Yes.
And I kind of want to show all of these different possibilities. And I didn't totally think that maybe that's because I'm one of those different possibilities,
You are one of those different possibilities. And look how much richer your life is for you than
Right.
it would be following a path that someone else actually was created for you.
Right.
So yeah, pretty interesting. Now, this is not to denigrate being a designer. There are just
right.
say that there are certain people. I've known one or two people in my life who were designers from the time they were 13 years old, and that's what they wanted to do, and they are fantastic. They have a bullet, as they used to say in Billboard magazine, and that's just what they do, and they do it fantastically well. But others of us are more like spider webs, more like. And if Silas ever listens to this, he'll laugh because Silas Monroe, because we're always talking about nodes and rhizomes. And he's the nodal one and he's the rhizomatic one. But we're more like nodes for cultural information. And that's for me, a much more satisfying life. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you, to kind of like turn this back on your career and the evolution of your career, when you kind of realized that split and that that design wasn't necessarily, or being a designer in the traditional sense was the kind of career path you were on, how did that turn? Where did you end up going next? Is that when you started were you teaching then, or kind of how did all of these things start to come into that career?
Well, the interesting thing is, okay, so this is the weird thing. My career has been just a series of fabulous accidents. It
I
has
love
been.
that.
And it always cracks me up when my students, whom I adore, think that they're going to plan out their careers, because
Yeah.
they're not. They're going to plan out a ladder that they're going to try to go up or over.
Hmm.
But life is not that way. So I was always planning structures that I was going to do, and then something would hit me from the side, and it would be far better than what I had planned. And then I would just do that. I would get on that mothership for a while. So there was no plan.
Okay.
That's a long answer to your short question. There was no plan. However, you asked me sort of how I got started in this. Is that what that question was?
Yeah. So I guess, even if there wasn't a plan, where did you had to do
Well,
something. And so,
I'll tell you what happened. I know you had to do something. And so the first thing that happened to me is, as my father used to say, my father, the English professor, used to say, it's not who you know, it's whom you know. Okay. So I
yeah.
was in grad school, and Ellen Lupton tripped in, and she was like
Oh,
the youngest brilliant person, to ever hit the planet. And she came in to talk to us about something, and she read something I wrote, and she said, do you want to put this in the AIGA journal? At that time, the AIGA had a journal.
right.
So I said, are you kidding? I would die for that. So I wrote a little piece for her in the journal. And that's where it really got started. And then um, um, Steve Heller called me up and said, you look like you could use a job. I didn't know him. He said, I think I queried him for an article, and he wrote back and said, you probably need a job. Why don't you take this job as the director of programs for the AIGA?
Oh, wow.
I said, well, yeah, I'll take that job, since I was eating, lentils.
Hmm.
So I did that for a few years, and learned a ton. This was years ago. This was in the 90s, right? So
Hmm.
90s world. And I got to be sort of the butler for every famous designer ever. All those old modernists who started dying off right then. I met
Right.
them all, right? And I was
Right.
sort of giving them coffee and stuff like that, and asking them to speak and stuff. But I met everybody because of that job. And then that made me a good history teacher later on, because I knew them all.
Mhm.
So it was like stories Natalia tells of her, misspent youth.
There's something about the timing of that I think was also really
It
perfect
was
for you, especially as design writing in that moment suddenly had a new type of currency, and
very
at
exciting.
least there seemed to be a hunger for it. What was that like?
That is
Were you
really
able to kind of
true.
plug into that?
I was. And after when I started writing about design, it was it's still tiny. It was a tiny niche. There were like 3 people writing about design, and you'd see them over and over in those wonderful little critical books, whatever they were called, Looking Closer. You'd see
Yeah.
them.
That's where I first saw your name, was
Yeah,
in
so
one of those Looking Closer
yeah,
books.
so if you looked closer, you saw that it was the same 7 people over and over.
Right.
So, and they were really good books, and they were cited the first books of these sort of critical compendia in
Hmm.
America. There were some in Holland and stuff, but anyway. And so then that's a little niche, and the people, and they know you. You don't really know them, but you see them over and over.
Right.
And then there was like one book for design history, and we all know what that book was, right? The Phil Meggs book.
Yep. Yeah.
And during the 90s, so that's where I came in. I came in with the 7 people and the Phil Meggs book, right? And there had
Yeah.
never been, it's so funny now because it's 20 years ago, more than that, 25 years ago. 25 years
Hmm.
ago, nobody questioned the notion that history was not a linear progression out of the darkness and into the light. And that design history was this famous person, this famous person, this famous male white person, this famous
Hmm.
male white person.
Hmm.
Right? So that's what it was. And none of us questioned that.
Right.
So I had a moment to say, actually, I hate all of this. And actually, where am I supposed to stand? 6'2" Natalia that's mostly left-handed. Where do I fit into this? So that's why I wrote Chasing the Perfect, which was about that modernist agenda.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I wanted to talk to you about design history and kind of how you think about design history even now, because like you said, so I went to undergrad in the mid 2000s,
Oh, okay.
and we still use the school where I went still used
Mhm.
Meg's as the design history book,
Right.
and it was presented as this very clear linear
Hmm.
story,
Right.
uh, and it also and of this person was then influenced by this person, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Like you said, all men, all white men, most of
Yes.
them in Europe,
Yes.
um, and also kind of got boiled down to just style and aesthetics. This
Yes.
is what stuff looked like here. This is what stuff looked like here. No context, no
None.
kind of larger story.
Yes.
And then 10 years later,
Yes.
as a teacher now,
Uh-huh.
finding myself thinking about design history, I catch myself sometimes falling into
Yes.
that just because
Constantly.
that's how I was taught. And I'm
Yes.
curious how you think about that. How do you kind of
Well,
show this larger history, both design history, not just as a series of styles, but also not just a series of white men in Europe? Like how do you?
you have hit the nail on the head here. So I am old, okay? And I'm supposed to be like, wearing down and sort of taking more days off and stuff like that. But I can't. I haven't, because a whole huge thing developed, which was, history. So,
Mhm.
so as it turns out, perhaps time is not a line, and perhaps facts are not truth.
Mm.
So when you start to think about that, what time is and what truth is, and the truth of an object being held in its context, you realize that sort of everything we know about design history is an interesting patching together of facts, but perhaps does not betray the truth of the matter.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I was lucky, and this is where it gets weird, because I was lucky enough to have a wonderful linear design history teacher when I went to grad school. I had to take design history because I knew nothing about design, and I took it from this teacher, Doug Scott, who's the well,
Oh yeah.
yeah, he's the well-known historian of, and I took it in the '90s when I went to grad school, and then I took it again because I happened to be chaperoning a young kid in the summer school at RISD like 20 years later, and I took it again. I just sat in on this class again. And so this guy is the greatest linear historian we have, and you need to read, or he doesn't really write things, but you need to go to his class to see the best of that,
Right.
right? And so it's good to know what the best of that was. However, so I got the best of it. But that said, that story, the way we teach it now, has been completely blown apart.
Hmm.
That story is a huge fiction, right?
Hmm.
So that's what's really interesting in design. And so I have, um, we have a project going on where I work, which is called Parallel Narratives.
Yeah.
And my co-teacher and I are just basically compiling bibliographies a la Andrew Blauvelt. Remember
Hmm.
those in the '90s, his wonderful little
Hmm.
bibliographies.
Yeah.
Our students are compiling bibliographies about things they think have been left out of the conversation. That's all, that's their
Mm.
entire prompt. What is missing from the conversation? And we're making books about that. So she's extremely young compared to me, but she's an art historian that became a design historian. That's another
Okay.
pathway, right?
Yeah.
Her name is Elizabeth Patterson. So she and I got our students to do this because we decided, let's teach them the linear story with our own critical addenda, in that first year of design history, they get 4 semesters, which is more than anybody ever gets.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
There's 18 credits. They get in their whole thing, they get 18 credits of design history and criticism. Yeah. So they have 2 long 15-week semesters of the Western canon with addenda, take a look
Wow.
at this, think about, and then they have 2 semesters in which they decide what was missing, and they do like 100 citations in these bibliographies.
Wow.
And then and then that second year is called parallel narratives, and we look at narratives that did not come in to the Western European gaze, and we don't know the answers in that year. So mostly it's more of a conversation with the students than it is, here I'm telling you this. It's here I'm telling you this in the sophomore year. In the junior year, I will start a lecture, and then everyone piles in and sort of says, you need to put this woman in there, and you need to put this guy in here from Africa, and whatever.
Yeah.
And we look at the gaze, and it's not just the male gaze or the Western gaze, it's every person has a gaze. So
right.
We look at that in our own agenda for history. So it all gets sort of blown apart. And then
I love that.
Together. Oh, it is so cool. And my students are so amazing. I've never had students. Okay, I just have to say this thing about students.
Okay.
I've taught a few places. I teach at a little college that wasn't even on the map. When I was asked to teach there, I didn't know where it was. I never heard of it. It's a little college, Cornish College of the Arts. It has like 650 students. It's tiny.
Oh, wow.
So that means we can control and manipulate what they learn. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyway, I went off on that tangent about where I was. What did I start that? What was this beginning?
You were going to talk about students.
Oh, yes. So the students are the kind of students that we make them do this. We force them to do this bibliography. They start out like thinking that history is dry, and they end up, yelling at me in the hall about how they can't believe they didn't know this woman existed. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They are incredibly intense students, and they get this bibliography done in that first semester. In the second semester, they're like, can we present this? And can I write a paper about this? Because I need to present
Oh, that's amazing.
It's completely opposite from any experience I've had before.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting about, I've had a similar experience, and I taught a typography class last year, I guess it was, that had a lot of type history in it, and I tried to present it. I actually wish I went farther with it now, kind of hearing how you talk about it, but kind of presented that linear history, but presented it as this is what we say is design history.
That's what you do. Yeah.
But it's not the whole story. And so kind of invited the students to challenge it, to ask questions about it, to kind of wrestle with it a little bit. And I was so blown away by how into kind of thinking about this they got. And then kind of realizing that history is this living thing, that they are a part of it, and that like even something as simple as like saying that some kind of work is experimental feels kind of old-fashioned now.
Because
and they got it.
Look what you're putting on it to say it's experimental. You've got a whole concept behind that, like,
Right. And that they got into it and got that and raised questions that got me excited. Just like completely changed how I think about design history because of basically just asking my students some questions, and what they came back with kind of blew me away.
Okay, so here's the big thing. So I've taught history for a long time, right? And so I taught it originally the way I had been taught it, just like you did with writing. And I didn't question it. I didn't question it. I thought, well, maybe there were some women, they obviously were inferior. Honest to God. Not that. It just was completely inculcated. So I would teach from the Meg's book, and then that's what design history was. And it's been a slow process. And the process has been instigated by my students, by our students. Right. It wasn't my idea. It was theirs, because I particularly remember one student, Chelsea Reyes. For some reason, I can remember her name. I can never remember anybody's name. And she hammered on me. This was like 10 years ago, maybe, or 7 or 8 years ago. She hammered on me. Why are we not studying any Mexican designers? I was like, because there are no Mexican designers. Honestly,
Wow.
God, I thought that. I thought maybe there's one or two,
Yeah.
So she said, well, here's some Mexican designers, Natalia. And sort of the scales fell from my eyes. That's how
Yeah.
you don't have to start out aware. You just have to listen to your students.
Right.
And they will tell you what they need.
Can we talk more about that kind of evolution for you as a teacher? I'm interested in. I'm going to ask you this question in two ways.
Okay.
I'm kind of curious about how your own teaching philosophy, approach, process has changed over your career as a teacher, but I'm also interested in how. I've been teaching for 4 years now, so I'm a very new teacher, but I'm very interested in how design education has
Oh,
changed
yeah.
in general over your career. Because, like I said earlier, I mean, I'm only out of undergrad 10
Right.
years, and it's already feels completely different. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, someone who's been kind of teaching over these changes, what has that been like?
Well, I always feel I got into design at exactly the most interesting time there could have been because
Yeah, yeah.
I went to grad school in 1989. And
Mm-hmm.
at that time, I had been a designer. I was 30 years old. I was like getting to be 30. I don't know if I was 30. And I had already had a career as a designer without a computer. So
Right.
I span that hand skills to computer skills thing. And I had to crack my brain open to learn these original computer things that we had, in 1989. So I survived that shift, which is everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe we should write a book about that. That's pretty, it's
Yeah.
because design is not um, does not is not at all what it was originally. Originally in my world, right? And so that process has been. I think for a different person, it could have been disorienting. But since I'm pretty much disoriented all the time anyway, it didn't really affect
Yeah.
me. But I've just always had to keep up with change. You have to be a person who I'm not a person who embraces change. But I know it when I see it.
Right.
And I adapt to it and try to figure out what's going to happen next, which is the fun part.
Have there been any changes that have been especially hard in the industry as you think about like teaching those changes? And the reason I asked that, we were talking about Nancy Skolos before we started recording, and I asked, when I interviewed her and Tom,
Yeah.
they both immediately were like, technology, like that is the hardest change because it is moving so fast. And you're kind of talking about like, you survived that, so that was no big deal. Has there been anything like that for
I
you?
don't really care about technology so much. I mean, I live in Seattle, which is techno world. So it's
Yeah.
just a given. You breathe it and you don't think about it as something other. It's just part of your day. I once was lecturing and I heard a buzz and I turned to the side and there was a drone hovering by my head.
Was it an Amazon one? I mean, you're in
No,
Amazon
it was
country.
not. Oh, are we ever?
Okay.
I can't get Lyft to realize that I'm not on the Amazon campus. Walk all over to get it to realize I'm not there. Anyway, so it's just a part of your everyday, and so it's a miracle that I don't have to think about that much. I don't think that technology is design. So it's not like, oh, now there's technology. I mean, technology has always been design ever since Gropius. He was just like, ooh,
Right.
technology, let's whatever. So that doesn't bother me so much. The thing that's been a hard change for me is making. In the olden days, there was one way to do things, and it was the modernist way. And if you figured out the rules of the game, you could play the game. For me, the hard and interesting part is to have the layering effect of the postmodern era, really, or the postmodern era, really. the layering effect of different patterns for good aesthetics. So
Hmm.
I have had to learn many relationships of aesthetics that and then find cohesion in those, as opposed
Right.
to this is right and this is wrong.
Right.
So that is more of a cultural shift and a global shift. And that's the thing that's been hard for me. But as far as, okay, now we can doodle in the sky with a free blah, blah, who cares? I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting. My students keep me updated with it. I don't have to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. You're exactly right, though. I mean, I think about that too. And and maybe this could lead into a little bit of a discussion on criticism
Oh,
also. Of also, I don't mean to keep just kind of bringing this back to my
well, I
education.
think
Um,
education is very interesting. So,
but it was also like a very modernist system in that you set up grids and you use these typefaces, and this is good design and this is bad design, and that it connects to our design history discussion. Like, that's not really true. And it's really easy to fall back on that when you are looking at a bunch of students' work that all looks different, to then still hold that up as the judge,
yes.
or as the criteria, or as the pinnacle of good design.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting to me about my students is how much more aware of design culture they are
Oh,
than we were,
oh,
in that they all have Instagram and Pinterest and all these things where they're like just consuming visuals in a way that just wasn't even possible
correct. Yeah.
when I was in school. Definitely when you were starting.
Oh, please.
Has that changed how they kind of come to the program?
It's a completely different thing. I mean, we had a Xerox machine, as a graduate student. We were like, ooh, I can put my face on the Xerox machine. I mean, it was pathetic when you look at like
Yeah.
just yesterday. Oh, what day is this? I can't even remember. But the last time I was in class, one of my sophomores came up to me, pranced up to me and said, look what I did. And they had made while I was talking, they had made a composite poster of a picture of one of the Bauhaus a dancer in the Bauhaus who was doing,
Yeah.
that ballet,
Yeah.
the triadic ballet or whatever. And,
Hmm.
and then right next to it, a picture of a rotisserie chicken, and it was the same form. Now,
Oh, wow.
in graduate school, they had done that in like 5 minutes. So graduate school, that would have taken me 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
completely different, the vocabulary is suddenly enormous. And that's a problem for design students. It's actually a problem. There's a famous poem, actually it's in the book because I quote it so much, called by Wordsworth,
Yeah.
nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room. And what it's a sonnet. It's about the sonnet form it's such a strict form, it allows creativity. So
Yeah.
students who don't have a formal structure, one formal structure, or a few, just a couple, have the terrible decision making of overchoice. From overchoice,
Right.
it's very hard to establish their own voice because they are hearing every voice. So I think that's a
Right.
real problem in studio. So I always ask students, I don't teach studios as much as I used to, thank God. But I always ask them to avoid just looking at everything. Just
Yeah.
take a vacation and think about what's coming from you. But that's a very sort of, Johannes Itten sort of woo type of approach, but it still
Yeah.
works, So I go back to that. The Zoroastrians had something going for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely am guilty of too much consumption too. I get it. I think it's really easy to kind of fall down
Oh, it's so easy.
that hole. And I think what you're saying about like all of these voices
Mhm.
And I kind of want to connect that to criticism a little bit, actually, because, you were talking about how when you started writing, there were the 7 of you.
Yeah.
And something that's interesting to me is how kind of everybody knows design now. And I've talked to a lot of people on the podcast about how, a company will redesign their logo and the New York Times will have a story about that.
No, it's just
now.
Because the surface, scratching the surface.
Yep, you got it.
Is what it is about right now, surface.
Yeah.
Right? But, it's not as though we suddenly all became surface people. It's just the technology thing. I hate the word technology. I sort of never want to say that word again.
Okay. All right. Well, we won't say it the rest of this conversation.
I mean, people like technology. It's like remember when people used to talk about new technologies? Oh my God.
Yeah.
Please stop. Okay.
Yeah. But does
Sir.
Does that type of discussion that everybody is talking about design has become this kind of buzzword in culture, even
design thinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was IDEO pretty much put a trademark on those words. And business picked it up in the last, I'd say, 7 or 8 years? And if I hear those words again, I will shoot someone, not myself, because it's disgusting. It's like, here, let's all prance around in a parking lot wearing, tin cans on our heads. This is going to free us to design things. I mean, this is such a buzzword, and all I hope for American business is that it lets this go.
I mean, we're in agreement. My dislike of the term design thinking and how design thinking is preached is well on the record in many of these conversations. And I guess the question is, how do we kind of get that discourse back? Like, it can't go back to the 7 people. Like, I actually don't like the field is too big for that. I think if we're only talking to each other, that's not helpful either. Right. But if like the technology reporters, the business people, if these are all the people who are talking about design publicly, how do we kind of take back control of that conversation and be like, well, okay, but we kind of think about our work this way. You know what I mean?
I think I have an answer to that.
Okay.
Or a answer, not the answer. And this has to do with the fact that I just had a very interesting conversation with a guy who's my financial planner, weirdly enough.
Okay.
Because when you get, into your 60s, you have things like financial planners. It's weird. But anyway, I was talking to him about money, and he got his degree in economics. And he said, the most important thing in economics is to figure out what the assumptions are. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's it for design. Design thinking, the sort of the trademark to design thinking that all business people speak, has got a very narrow number of assumptions. And those assumptions were sort of written on, carved on tablets by IDEO and the Stanford Design School. But that's not what design is. That's just a sort of little sketch of a kind of design approach. It is one design approach, but it is certainly not, it's one of 100,000 approaches.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that we need to do is challenge assumptions. And every time somebody says something like that, or it irritates you with that, you have to say, now, what is it that you think that is? What is it that you think design thinking is? Because it's not a question of taking things back, but of moving things forward.
I think this is actually like a really nice place to talk about the new book a little bit.
Because thank you for doing that.
Something that I liked about the book, and as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I'm teaching a design writing class, and so I was reading your book through the lens of my class, and
that couldn't be better. We should have sent you one to, see how it worked with your class.
Yeah, I wish I had the book 3 months ago.
No, we would have done that. Yeah.
But one of the on the first day, I gave them a couple readings about kind of the intersection of design and writing and how they influence each other and all of that. And I had them write down questions that they had from the readings about the readings and about the class and what the class was going to be. And I had a couple questions about, well, why do we need to write? How does this help us get jobs? What is the point of design criticism? All design looks the same anymore today. It was like kind of negative questions.
The logos and yeah.
But I used the same thing that you write in the introduction of the book, which is that if you think of the designers that you know, who are like the famous designers, they are all also writers. I think that's current designers. I also think that applies to a lot of the designers of history. And I think talking about that, challenging assumptions, and I think writing is actually a way to do that. And I think, I want to, for people who haven't read the book, I want to be clear, you're not saying that all designers should
not by any means.
Be writers.
No,
if designers are doing that can help kind of start that conversation, or at least offer alternative conversations.
Oh, you are so smart. I mean, it's really true. So what it is that the world actually works on writing. I mean, you hear it as speech, Alexa or whatever, but that's all writing, actually.
Right. Yeah.
All that writing is organized thought. That's what it is. It's not, I before E except after C and stuff like that. What it really, you can get a copy editor for that. What real writing is organized thought. So every designer already does that. They organize thoughts. The reason it's important to write is that most of your audience, not your design audience, is getting their information from reading or from something being read to them, like a script, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's the way most people process information. We design people process information mostly through our eyes, but most people process it through their ears or through reading. So that's a hard realization for designers because they don't think that way very often. So it's really important to just to work that muscle because, as you said, if you've heard of a designer, that person is a writer. Right. Look at Sagmeister, fantastic writer. Look at Mirko Ilic, for instance, or Stefan Bucher. Any of those people, or Silas Monroe. I could go on and on because I love all these guys. Anyway, I should think of some women and some other people, but I can't. Anyway.
Lorraine Wild.
Thank you. Please help me.
Yeah,
Ellen Lupton.
Jessica Fan, Ellen Lupton.
I'm really digging myself a grave here. Okay. So Ellen. Oh my God. I mean, how many books has she written? So would you know about Ellen Lupton if she had never written a book?
Where'd this idea for the book come from? Was this something you'd been thinking about for a while?
Oh, well, this is one of those weird things. I plan one thing and somebody else calls me up and something else happens. So I just got an email one day from a publisher, Bloomsbury, Bloomsbury Academic, which is a part of Bloomsbury, which is an enormous publisher. And they said, would you like to write a book about writing for design? I said, yes. And that's how that happened. I mean, so I always have these super lucky things. But the reason that happened was, I also put a spin on it that it's all luck, and it is. But also I make things and stuff. So I had written a bunch of things about what to write, what to do and what not to do, these sort of tip sheets for my students, and they were on my website. And so this editor had seen those, and she thought it would be fun to have a design writing book.
You open the book, kind of addressing designers, saying, you've probably told yourself the story that you're not a good writer, that you're a visual person, all of this, but that these two activities are actually kind of more related than they seem, and have a valuable part of their practice. I'm kind of curious how you I don't know how to ask this question in a better way, but like, how do you sell that to designers? How do you kind of get designers to
designers understand it, and you know that you have a good book idea when you start writing a book, and the person says, what are you writing about? And I say, I'm writing a book that teaches designers to write. and they get that look in the eye like, oh, then you know that you've got a good book idea. If they're like yada
Yeah.
yada, then they're not, they're not interested.
Yeah. Well, let me ask it not using the word selling, because I don't know why I led the question
Okay, just
that way, because I am thinking about it with my own design writing students who, I asked them all, what's your relationship to writing? What's the last thing you wrote? And 75% of them, I don't like writing. I'm not a good writer. I don't want to be in this class, but it's required.
just like what I was saying in the introduction, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to do this. I hate this. I'm afraid. My body is setting into concrete.
Yeah. And so, like, how do you, I guess, whether it's with the book, whether it's with your own students, I'm asking this very selfishly, how do you kind of show designers that, hey, you're not necessarily a bad writer? I mean, it's just like what you think of as writing is not the only type of writing, kind of like what we were talking about design.
Exactly. Well, first of all, I don't spend a lot of time promoting writing. I just spend a lot of time yelling at them about writing. I don't say,
oh, interesting.
You could write, how wonderful it would be for you. I was like, clean this up.
Yeah.
Get serious. You need to speak the language of your culture, and you need to be able to make a point. You need to be able to convince somebody, and you need to be able to say what you have to say in the clearest and most accessible way, or else you're going nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you write that down or say it aloud, it doesn't really matter, because all that you're really doing when you're teaching writing is teaching people to organize their thoughts, which means that they have to figure out what their thoughts are, and then they have to map them, and then they have to organize that map, and then they need to spit it out. That's all.
And when you say it like that, it's actually kind of the design process.
It is. Exactly.
And that's what I loved. I mean, not to then just talk about how much I love the book, but that's what I loved about it.
Book. I mean, you're the first, person that's really, sort of talked about it to me. So it's
yeah. And I guess we should say, for people listening to this, we're recording this on the day of the publication. So it's not like, that this book's been out and you haven't heard anything.
And nobody talked about it. Yeah, no. I've been very lucky, very lucky with pre-sale. We've been very positive here. It's been great.
But that's kind of what I love about it, is that you're kind of really showing that the writing process and the design process are kind of the same thing. Yeah. And the output is just a little bit different, but the kind of way of approaching a design project is actually kind of the way of approaching a writing project.
Yeah, it's, the whole thing with teaching writing is with, like, same teaching design or teaching, I don't know how to plant bulbs. The thing that you have to do is make the student comfortable. And I don't mean that they should be sitting in a lounge chair. I mean, they have to be not afraid, because people don't learn things if they're afraid. Right? So most of my teaching these days is about making students feel unafraid.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and that's really it. If you can really do that, then your students will bloom. And if you walk in there, especially as a teacher who has not had a lot of experience, and you start ordering around and thinking you should be tough and stuff like that, they're all going to shrivel up, and you're not going to get any good work out of them. So, yeah. So the whole book premise is, don't be afraid of this. Don't feel like there's some big golden key that you didn't get. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know, and you can do it. And they can.
Right.
That's the really weird part, is that, guess what? They can do it, and they become amazing writers.
I have two more questions. These are the two questions that I use to end all of these conversations.
Okay.
The first one is, and it's especially interesting to kind of ask you this now, as this book that you've just written is now out in the world. What are the topics or subjects that you're thinking about now? What are your kind of current interests?
That's on my mind now is how to circumvent the not to use the word gaze again, but I'm using it, the point of view that I have, and be able to write or compile a small history book that does not filter design history through the Western gaze. I said again.
Yeah.
So my co-teacher, Elizabeth Patterson and I, are working on a proposal for a small book that's about 12 flat things. And there are 12 flat things that that different designers around the world think are important. So each one of them has picked a topic or a thing and said, this is important to me and this is why. That way we get out of the conundrum of editing the person, because what we don't want to be doing is like, and here we are, two white females saying that this is good. We don't want to be in that position. But we do want to make a compendium of these stories about why this piece of graphic design is important to this person at this time.
I love that.
I'm working on. That's what we're working on together.
My last question, throughout this conversation, you've mentioned people that you've studied with or people that have influenced you in your thinking. I'm curious, just for a few other either writers, critics, teachers, books that have kind of influenced how you think about all of this that we've talked about today.
Oh, I just love your questions. May I just say you are influencing me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means so much.
I don't know if I've had this much fun since I got a new pair of tennis shoes. I mean, this is really good. This is fun. Okay.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you so much. I truly, really appreciate that.
I truly, really mean it. I've been affected by weird things that have nothing to do with design.
I love it. Go for it.
One of my favorite writers is Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death, which is about why we make things.
Okay. I don't think I know that name.
Ernest Becker. He died in the 70s. He died very young. He was an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist. And one of those guys who brings a lot of things together. So he brings in a lot of things. The book I actually just excerpted from my students right now. My poor students, what they read. Anyway, it's called The Birth and Death of Meaning. Right. So I'm interested in people who are interested in meaning and how things mean. Right. So I read stuff like that. Who else? Who really has influenced me hugely is my dear beloved Jan van Toorn.
Yeah.
Who was my advisor.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know that.
He was my advisor in graduate school. Seriously, the reason I adore him is because he opened up the whole idea of using design strictly for social good. And to getting away, he was the father of getting away from the thing that Gropius started, which was an alliance with industry. So his work in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and today, he's still working and making amazing collages today. His work is strictly about social good. And that's different from design activism, which is another thing, really.
Right.
So he's important. Who else? I don't know. There's so many people. So many people have helped me along the way and just made huge contributions to my career.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great great list, and that's a great way to wrap this up. This was so fun for me. I really enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, I love the new book, and I'm really glad to have you on the podcast. Thanks for this conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
This episode was recorded on February 21st, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.